We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Take your own advice.
What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No delusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Welcome to the AnteDote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Kushel.
All right, it is Tuesday, March 19th, 2024, and we're going to get back into a bit of a looking forward to the spring, the things to as far as we did part one on our most recent program. Now we're going to dig back into things using current events to kind of as a preview for things that are going to be very prevalent going forward. And we have to talk about, we've been following some of these for a while now. We've been following the trend that was in place, I think, really before October 7th to a pretty not insignificant level, and now is starting to become as October 7th becomes more and more distant time-wise, it's starting to really come back again, and that is the attempt to dealing with, or at least trying to keep some element of control over the Benjamin Netanyahu gang in Israel, and the increased set of hardliners and people who are really pushing to escalate and keep this war post October 7th going. And I think that maybe the biggest example we've seen yet of this public, I would say, pushback, both certainly public, I think, in a number of years, maybe ever, in terms of political, in terms of American politics, is Senator Charles Schumer, the name, basically protector of Israel, as he's called.
The Shomar of the Senate.
The Shomar of the Senate, and one of the most fervently pro-Israel, pro-Zionist members of Congress at either party, the leader of the Democratic Party in the Senate, publicly, basically straight up saying that Netanyahu cannot stay in power. And this is to say this is a major escalatory step in terms of not only trends that we've been seeing going on for a while now, but also for things to come. I would say that's an understatement. And the reaction to this has been quite interesting as well, because and we'll talk more about this, but it was framed in, there were some things, framed in like Netanyahu's lost his way. So it's kind of like back when you were doing 9/11, you weren't so bad, but now you've lost your way. So there's obviously some problems there, but the fact does not change that, like, the leader of the Democratic Party in the Senate, one of the stalwarts for Israel, is publicly
as they
saying,
also say, the highest ranking Jew in the American government.
There you go. Yes. As saying Netanyahu has to go, and it was part of a four-pronged list of names and groups. And it's interesting. He named off Hamas. The Palestinian Authority was the Abbas wing of it, basically. And there's a development there with the Palestinian Authority you were telling me about, Jeremy. And then also the particular hardliners that have come to tremendous power and influence within the Israeli government, that being Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. And so Netanyahu is mentioned directly right along here, and it's in terms of, like, Netanyahu is basically, the way it sounded to me was, he's overstayed his welcome. He's not of benefit to Israel anymore, and he needs to go. And this is the fact that this was said publicly by not only any sitting senator or sitting representative, but Charles Schumer, is just this was quite an incredible sight to behold and see play out.
It's interesting too, the timing of this. It appears to me to be parallel with Biden with the Irish leadership, where the Irish leadership actually talks about the deep connection between Ireland and the Palestinians. And it's interesting, like, there actually were rumblings from Biden back 2 years ago, I think in 2022, about his Irishness in relationship to understanding the Palestinians' plight in terms of not having full access to their own homelands. And of course, it was watered down in the normal American-Israeli special relationship kind of way. But now that there's more public gloves being taken off directly against Netanyahu, obviously, still, acting, everyone from Schumer to Biden acting as if they're the real president of Israel or something like that, is going alongside where Biden was just recently in presence of, and apparently a little bit uncomfortable, but not interrupting the Irish leadership and talking about the nature of the deep Irish-Palestinian solidarity. So, and then when you factor in on top of what we talked about last time in terms of the secretary, the Department of Treasury and specifically the Office of Foreign Assets Control Department of the Treasury. Remember, this is the same department that used to be controlled during the Trump years by what looked to be like a straight up Israeli partisan, Sigal Mandelkin. I forget her last name exactly, but she was the one who implemented intense controls around the question of the New Horizons conference. There's a whole obvious, deeper and more nuanced history in terms of our understanding of those networks and how I directly, personally was, being invited into that network directly for that conference, and thought better of it in terms of the development of my understanding. But to go from a direct Israeli partisan in the control of that very specific Treasury office to now where that office is directly deploying sanctions against an Israeli military intelligence officer who was in power of Unit 81 on September 11th, is, I think, a major indicator of, at the very least, some kind of high-level understanding of, at the very least, Netanyahu, the adversary, as we were beginning to talk about it in terms of his autobiography, and then when it broke in the mainstream press, where was it Newsweek or Time that had the front page?
Time.
The front page story of Netanyahu, the adversary. And so more and more, there's a sense of that, although publicly it's just a trying to tokenize Netanyahu as the totality of the problem here, rather than something much deeper structurally in terms of the entire Zionist project and its relationship, the special relationship, which I've always pointed out is very creepy in terms of its nomenclature and the way it's described. And as we've gone over multiple decades of the historical facts, that in the logistical reality of it, it is probably the most dangerous relationship that the United States has had since the rise of the U.S. national security state, in terms of the National Security Act of 1947, basically concurrently with the rise of Israel as a Jewish state. And so there is a lot on the table right now. And obviously, last time we pointed out that we're anticipating spring. We're now very close to spring. We have passed the Ides of March that we recognized last year as a danger point. And then obviously we're now on the precipice of the 21st anniversary of the launching of the Iraq War. So I would say, although Netanyahu is obviously used as almost a trope for the deeper problem here, in certain ways, that the focus on him is proper. I'd say
Yes.
Netanyahu is probably the most dangerous single figure in the entire world right now. I think it would be, the facts as we know them would directly identify Netanyahu as the most dangerous international terrorist and way beyond of the last, of definitely the entirety of the 21st century, from his obvious deep role in September 11th, not only celebrating it afterwards, but logistically with key questions on the ground, especially in terms of Ground Zero, Manhattan, the World Trade Center, the Larry Silverstein connections. And now there's more that's now coming up in terms of Trump, even where Trump has to cover these massive bonds, these penalties in terms of what he owes in terms of his defamation for rape case, E. Jean Carroll, where he appears to have some kind of very suspicious relationship now with the Greenberg son, so Maurice Hank Greenberg's son, who runs Chubb International Insurance, with deep connections, not only in terms of the United States and Israel, but also in very much into the Eastern sphere, Russia and China. So potentially Trump on the line for hundreds of millions of dollars in terms of this bonding via a key player, I would say a familial player in terms of both the 9/11 and the 11/9 operations, right? Remember Greenberg, AIG acquires Kroll, I believe, as Kroll comes into power in the World Trade Center after the 1993 bombing. And then by the time that September 11th approaches, is fully ensconced, Kroll, under AIG, right? And so then 11/9, you also then have the CNI, the Center for National Interests, formerly the Nixon Peace Center, then eventually run by a guy named Dimitri Simes or Simes, who apparently went running after around the January 6th operation and the attempted conspiracy to defraud the United States. Just the basic legal, that's just the basic. It's very likely way worse than that. It's very likely in the role of sedition and then potentially treason when you think about actual foreign hybrid warfare attacks on the American body politic and the American system and government in terms of the 2020 into January 6, 2021 operation. These people are at the epicenter of some of this. And so Simes, I think it's probably Simes, I don't know. Dimitri Simes ran this CNI for many years. And the head of the board there were Henry Kissinger and Maurice Hank Greenberg. And we've gone through that a lot, and the deep connections between Warner Brothers, CNN, CNI leadership. And Simes went running to Russia, and as far as I see, he's actually runs a major Russian television debate show, some kind of news show, against with his sort of counterpart in the format of something like Hannity and Colmes from Fox News kind of scenario of a guy who directly intergenerational, obvious KGB guy. And so this is some of the deeper network here. If we want to look into it, is the Greenberg connection to September 11th. And Netanyahu, I think, is got to be seen as at the epicenter of all the worst aspects of the quote unquote new American century. From September 11th, he's right there. I still believe the contextual circumstantial evidence points to him in terms of his decades-long history of facilitating and propping up the war on terror as a pretext for something like the Oded Yinon plan and clean break operation introduced to him as he comes into prime minister power via the facilitated by the Arthur Finkelstein network. That you got to see Netanyahu at the epicenter of September 11th, definitely at the epicenter of the Iraq war push. He is the voice of the Israeli government, the lone voice of the Israeli government, allowed to cajole and testify and browbeat the American Congress into the Iraq war when he comes in the fall of 2002. And once again, he's also at the epicenter of the 11/9 Trump operation. very obviously. And it is definitely a sign of the dog that didn't bark that all these mainstream media and Democratic Party politicians are, while they are, softly confronting Netanyahu on American airwaves, are also failing to uh, put up the evidence that has been dealt with by us, for example, for since Trump was in power, that this was a very Netanyahu-centric operation to install Trump. And now with like a full-length book by someone like James Bamford that's now been put into basically the nation ghetto in many ways and used to limit another part of the hangout of the 11/9 operation in terms of the trying to pretend like the Russian piece is just a Israel blaming it on another very little involved element rather than actually part of a Putin Netanyahu Trump axis. And none of them are utilizing the information from Bamford's book that solidifies with facts that this was a Netanyahu operation via his like main consigliere fixer, Isaac Malho, I think his name is. And so obviously this would be the perfect way for someone like CNN's Dana Bash to push back against Netanyahu when Netanyahu accuses Schumer of trying to involve himself in the Israeli domestic process by saying, "Well, weren't you involved? Didn't you have Isaac Malho, help install Trump?"
Wasn't the guy who led the way in pushing the Swift boat and birther conspiracies involved in this too, Mr. Prime Minister?
Right.
Exactly. I mean, it's you'd think it would be a very. And I don't know if you still wanted to, if you had another point you wanted to make. I'll let you before I talk again. But
well, go for. I just want to acknowledge too that we're okay. So we're somewhere between the spring and the Ides of March. Ramadan has now started, so a Ramadan Mubarak to our Muslim friends and listeners, and it is a very dicey time right now, obviously, especially in Gaza, but really all around the world. And the American domestic political context there is so much happening, and maybe we'll go over some of the legal things that will be happening in April.
All right. And Jeremy, I agree with you on both the insufficiency of the scapegoating of Netanyahu. On one hand, it seems that he is being the person who's now being frontal taking the blame as far as while also covering for deeper elements, both that we have gone on, that we've talked so much about and that other people have talked so much about. But also, it's absolutely appropriate, as you said, like it is. And one thing about this Schumer speech was interesting, like with all the problems around it. I know a lot of people would bristle and at the description of talking about the Hamas gang or problems with certain elements of Palestinian leadership with the Palestinian Authority. But I thought, like, outside of the obvious issues that are there with like the description of, well, Netanyahu, you weren't so bad in the terror war days, but now you've lost your way and you need to go. I thought it was a pretty good description of a number of the problems right now, as far as from both obviously directly from the Israeli government side but then also from the side of what we've been talking about with this Hamas horseshoe of that goes on through the propping up and direct sponsoring in some ways of the Hamas, but then also the Russian factor that goes with it as well. And I thought it was a pretty decent summarization of the problems, as far as from directly speaking, from directly right there in as it relates to the direct on the portions of of everything that's taken place. And obviously, for people who wanted to get more than that from Chuck Schumer, you're not going to get it. And obviously it's not sufficient, but at the same time, this is a major step because, as you've talked about, just how the prevalent role of Netanyahu. And this is one thing where these people who just have this idea of the U.S.'s real special relationship as this be all end all kind of thing, whether it would be your more leftist, anti-war, anti-imperial types who just see this all as the American empire and Israel just working hand in glove together, or the types of people who think that the Zionist, the tail wags the American dog and all of this. But you have to look at Netanyahu as more than just another person, like just another figure leader, as far as just another like person who's been in a position of power or influence. No, this is as you said, like the seminal figure of the last 25 to 30 years, even going back longer term, going back to 1979 and the Jerusalem conference. And you mentioned that as well in the lead up to the global war on terror, as I think we know it in its modern manifestation. This is the seminal figure going back a number of years, a number of decades. So the direct emphasis and focus on Netanyahu cannot be ignored, or I don't think it should be downplayed. I think this is very significant, and especially now, like also the direct focus on the hardliners of Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich and that whole contingent there, and how it relates to our own domestic politics and our own turn as far as what's happened in Western countries, here in the United States in particular, our country, but also other countries in this global shifting. And Israel has fallen into that, where it's moved away from, where it has taken the shift not only in terms of having like militant, in terms of the battlefield, in terms of the dealing with the Palestinians and dealing with expansionism and settlement politics and all this, but also the direct face of the domestic politics. So this is part of this trend that's been going on globally, and now to see the Netanyahu being called out right along with these people that are basically like the American, they're basically like the Israeli Project 2025s, or the Israeli Marjorie Taylor Greens, and even more significant, they actually hold positions like these are cabinet positions. This would be like having, this would be, I don't know, like the Treasury Secretary or the Secretary of Commerce being, or even Attorney General or something. And by the way, there's talk of some pretty interesting people being named as potential Attorney Generals in the next Trump administration if he comes back. So this is all like in this, for right now, like to be, and I understand it might not be sufficient for a lot of people. Honestly, it's not sufficient. It could go much, much further than this, obviously. But this has got to be looked at, I think, as a welcomed and much needed step that Netanyahu is being focused on publicly in this type of regard. And also, I think it leaves out the hope that if Netanyahu were to go, you'd still have this problem of like maybe what's called the original sin of the state of Israel and the Zionism, and then the things that the U.S. state has been directly complicit in, of course. And there's a portion of that I don't think is set to change or anything. But at the very least, you could also be dealing with people who could actually be worked with in terms of potentially, like if the Americans were to, once again, we always say who's the GD superpower here, and trying to reestablish that. And that comes with its own problems, of course. But if there were some type of attempt to like reestablish like actual like international diplomacy and dealing with this problem in the region, rather than having this Netanyahu and all that comes with him in the Prime Minister's office, there is a potential for things to break through in terms of like actual meaningful dialogue and discussions that could potentially take place in the long run. And that's not for here nor now. That's not something to immediately focus on in the moment, but it's something to take into consideration but my bigger point is this is not just another political figure, not just another person who happens to lead a country, as far as like being just a player, like in a bigger, being seen as just like another person who really doesn't matter outside the fact that he's happens to be the current sitting prime minister in Israel. No, this is a seminal player. Then focusing on this is not just like focusing on any other political figure or leader. I think this really does need to be welcomed, and I think it's also important for people to kind of start to fill in those dots of what the Dana Bashes and or on the other side of obviously Netanyahu running to his the friendly media outlet Fox and Friends, and the Fox and Friends people just being so they're just so nice to Netanyahu, and they prostrate themselves perfectly for him while putting pressure on him from the right to, well, you need to denounce Biden as hurting Israel. But there's people that can fill in the dots as far as some of the deep political realities, long-term and short-term, that would give a much clearer picture of why this figure why it's welcomed and necessary for this particular personality to be focused on in a moment like this, and that the Democratic leader of the Senate, the Shomar, the protector of Israel, publicly saying he's got to go should not just be looked at as politics as usual. It's really anything but, I think, and different and dealing with that, as well as and then also attempting to actually try to figure out where the shortcomings of this are and actually trying to fill in and connect the dots rather than just dismissing it as just politics as usual, I think is something that we need to do, because this is this is quite something. And we can't just look at this as just another politics as usual dealing with all this, and the factors are so much more significant, and I would say there's a lot more at stake than just that.
Definitely, and I agree with you that a shorthand to understand the deep moral and historical hypocrisy of the moment in terms of the Schumers, for example, is like, okay, yeah, Netanyahu, everything was basically hunky dory while you were running, nuclear espionage in the 80s with Arnon Milchan, while you were apparently involved with the Jonathan Pollard complex, while you were doing the run up to September 11th, while you were orchestrating the war on terror more generally, while you were orchestrating the clean break doctrine, while you were helping orchestrate the 9/11s and the Iraq wars, and then the launching of the war on terror, or when you were then facilitating Israel's 9/11. Everything was hunky-dory until now, when you won't call elections in terms of Schumer's scenario. At the same time, it's also, I think you're also correct in that the Netanyahu is not just a figurehead. There's a similarity in terms of trying to play down Netanyahu as a figure it feels resonant to the way that the Noam Chomsky types would try to play down the Kennedy assassination and President Kennedy as an actual rupture in terms of the attempted foreign policy that was not only in relationship to Israel and the nuclear weapon and the context of the Cold War, but also more generally, a very likely anti-imperial American foreign policy in terms of the Cold War. And so you get a vibe like that, where the Chomsky types tried to play down and really just distort and deceive around the historical record on basic aspects in terms of the reversals of just very sort of cut and dry kinds of policies that were flipped from pre-November 22nd, 1963 to post-November 22nd, 1963. Two crucial examples, obviously, are the Vietnam War, where you have the National Security Memorandum 263 that Kennedy had signed in the weeks lead up to his assassination, that called for beginning to de-escalate all American troops on the ground in Vietnam to a point of where they would all be gone by really the 1965, which would be the first year of his second administration, where that then gets immediately reversed in the week after his assassination by the Johnson forces by Memorandum 273. Now, this was highly covered up for many years. There was finally some documentation of it, and Chomsky to this day, as far as I am aware, has totally dumbed out on this whole scenario. And then, of course, the other thing was the Israeli nuclear question, where you have a long evolving concern by the American government in terms of Ben-Gurion's operation to turn Israel into a nuclear weapons power. Okay, a lot of this began to become the Eisenhower administration became aware of it toward the end of it. They were always suspicious of it. and then they became concretely aware of it in the last year or two of the administration. And as Kennedy comes in, it gets more intense. And then in 1963, the gauntlet gets laid down in direct letters from Kennedy to Ben-Gurion. And Ben-Gurion then does one of these operations that he had a long history of doing, where he dips out from the Israeli administrative state at key moments in order to avoid these kinds of confrontations and conflicts with what they still wanted to be their most serious patron and security partner, the United States of America. And this gets totally reversed very, very soon after Kennedy's assassination. And you really see a bigger Israeli architecture to the Kennedy assassination and the installation of Johnson, deep Zionist loyalties and background, and all of that, with a then peaking of the 1967 war, the so-called Six-Day War, and then also the USS Liberty going down while Johnson is literally in bed with a Irgun Israeli operative, Matilda Krim, and all of the blood in the water evidence that Johnson was deeply involved with setting up the USS Liberty along with the Israelis.
Wasn't he quoted as saying the GD boat should be sunk?
Sunk. And what's interesting, there's this sort of not very well known incident in the immediate wake of the Kennedy assassination, where Johnson makes a call after, I believe this is after Jacob Rubinstein, key lieutenant of the Mickey Cohen Meyer Lansky organized crime syndicate operating in Dallas, where right after Ruby has been tasked to help assassinate the patsy Lee Harvey Oswald. And this reminds me a little bit of what we now have come to know about the nature of the Martin Luther King assassination, where he's shot by snipers, but it looks like he's actually then killed in the hospital. And something very similar happened, where Johnson calls into the hospital and says, "I want a deathbed confession. I want a deathbed confession from the suspect," meaning Lee Harvey Oswald. So you have a series of these kinds of Johnson operations. From the Liberty, he wants that thing. He wants a deathbed confession from the USS Liberty. He wants the GD thing at the bottom of the ocean. And he wants the Lee Harvey Oswald patsy. He wants a deathbed confession. Well, that means Oswald was still alive. And it does look like then he then is then probably killed by something similar to what happened with the King assassination. Someone in the operating room in the hospital who then makes sure that he dies. So this is Johnson's treason, and this is obviously part of the motive of those who assassinated Kennedy, was not to just get rid of a Kennedy problem. That was part of it. But it was also to install this Johnson character, because as the record begins to show more and more, as time comes to the present, Johnson was on his way out. It was very likely that Kennedy was going to choose another vice presidential candidate. And even Robert Kennedy had been very much against Kennedy bringing on Johnson as his running mate. Kennedy basically said that he was pretty much blackmailed by emissaries of the Israel lobby into taking him on. The Abraham Feinberg network attempted to basically purchase Kennedy's Middle East foreign policy. Kennedy accepted the money but refused the purchase of the policy. And so this kind of crew that had intent very much in relationship to Kennedy's larger foreign policy and obviously the Vietnam War, but most intensely and existentially in terms of Ben-Gurion seeing himself as the Israeli state and the so-called security of the Israeli state, saw that the Israeli nuclear weapon was core to his guardianship of the long-term existential security of the Israeli state. So that becomes an actionable item, which I then think, like in terms of thinking about Netanyahu as he's the crucial character of the Israeli deep state of the second generation of really the political Zionists, what we might call the neo-Jabotinsky turn of the Ben-Gurion types. So you have this first generation that included Ben-Gurion as the main figure, who then dealt with all of these so-called allegedly liminal, edgy characters from Yitzhak Shamir and the Stern gang, the Lehi, the very, Nazi Stalinist desiring collaboration of the Stern gang, the Lehi types, the very terrorists, mail bombs to British and officials and President Truman, and all of that background with the Stern Lehi, but also the Irgun in terms of Menachem Begin. Irgun deeply, at the epicenter of the King David Hotel bombing, so terrorism. And so it reminds me a little bit of what went down recently in terms of the Lex Friedman 5-hour so-called Israel-Palestine debate with Norman Finkelstein, Benny Morris, Muin Rabbani, and Stephen Borelli, Mr. Borelli, a.k.a. Destiny, who Finkelstein would look like purposefully get Destiny's name wrong. And Benny Morris is the crucial, I would say, new Israeli court historian. And it reminded me of Morris trying to play down the figure of Yitzhak Shamir when Rabbani brought up Shamir as a counter to the Grand Mufti as this crucial early Palestinian leadership that was hooked in with the Nazi leadership and interests and stuff like that. And Rabbani brings in Shamir as sort of like a whataboutism kind of thing. And Morris wants to basically play down the role of both the Stern Gang, Lehi, and of Yitzhak Shamir himself, and tries to pretend like that Ben-Gurion disciplined all these guys. The Stern Gang are just 300 nut jobs, that kind of thing. It sort of sounds similar to like what people who are trying to defend Netanyahu might say about the Ben-Gavirs and the Smotriches. Be like, sure, he was in an uncomfortable political relationship, but these guys aren't the mainstream of the Israeli government and all of that.
Or your more milquetoast commentators as far as like the whole like J6 type of gang. Like, this doesn't represent us. Yeah.
Yes, and so meanwhile, like what really Finkelstein and Rabbani specifically allowed Morris to do is cover up the actual deep history, deep politics of Israel, specifically of the Israeli security state. And because Shamir, it's not like Shamir was just like sent into the Negev desert, was under house arrest for a couple decades while Ben-Gurion ran the Israeli nuclear weapons program. No, the way that these so-called nuts were disciplined by Ben-Gurion was that they were put in charge of Israeli black operations. Yitzhak Shamir is at the highest levels of the beginning of the official Israeli assassinations program. All right. And this is in the 50s, in the mid 50s. And I think that there is a lot of circumstantial evidence that Shamir wasn't just sort of off field until he pops up as Prime Minister of Israel after Begin in the late 80s. No, or was it the early 90s when he came in, Greg? I always keep on forgetting.
Oh, we're talking about Shamir. Shamir would have been in the 80s. I think it would have encompassed the last part of the Reagan administration and then through the Bush administration. He was the prime minister, and then Rabin came in at the end of the Bush administration. But it was interesting. We were talking privately, off record, Shamir and H.W. Bush as maybe being 11, 22, 63 guys, and then this clash between the American government and the Israeli government then. But that's a little bit of a digression, but I think it is something that should be maybe taken into consideration possibly with these two figures and the way that the Israeli and American governments clashed at the time. But Shamir would have been late 80s and the early 90s.
And it definitely is. I would say it's not a coincidence that these credible allegations of an attempted or a potential Israeli assassination of George H.W. Bush goes down during the Shamir presidency, because if there's any single figure who represents multi-decade Israeli black ops assassination program, it's Yitzhak Shamir. Okay, and I would say that there is a substantial amount of circumstantial evidence that would point to, if the Israeli security state is at the epicenter of some of the logistics of the President Kennedy assassination, then the logical place to go looking is Yitzhak Shamir. And Ben-Gurion steps down, and then there is apparently a ramp up of the operation to assassinate an American president. And Yitzhak Shamir is very likely the epicenter. He's probably the logistics guy from the Israeli side of the Kennedy assassination. And it looks to me like they're very likely the large swaths of like then current and then eventual like high level Israeli leadership are there in Dallas alongside someone like a George H.W. Bush. To me, it looks like you probably have a Michael Harari on the ground. You potentially have a Yitzhak Hofi. Harari, the key Mossad covert operations commander for decades, has been accused of admitting to having helped plan September 11th in the immediate wake of September 11th. Harari, key Israeli intelligence official for the Western Hemisphere, key security guy for Manuel Noriega in Panama. The whole aspect of the the Israeli component of the drug running and the weapons trafficking and the propping up of the dictators throughout Central and South America. That ties into what's called Iran-Contra and all of that. That's Michael Harari at the epicenter of that. I believe he's on the ground on November 22nd, 1963 at Daley Plaza. And Yitzhak Rabin apparently there that day. And so there's lots of layers to this. And so I get a similar kind of sense of the archetype of the second generation of the neo-Jabotinskyite, the Iron Calf, terror state cell leadership. Netanyahu's the archetype of the second generation. The first generation is a much stranger, more difficult for the sort of liberal West to grapple with in a public political context, a conglomeration, because it goes everywhere from Ben-Gurion, who was a key intellectual foe in certain ways of like Jabotinsky, until it looks like he eventually turned toward being what I would call a neo-Jabotinskyite. And it's also Shimon Peres is at the epicenter. Remember, Shimon Peres is the one who is in Moshe Sharett, the second prime minister of Israel, the one who the so-called Lavon Affair Operation Susanna, the attempt to terrorize the West in Egypt, the failed operation, maybe it was set up to fail. It actually looks like that's a possibility. Sharet's in power. This is all being done by Ben-Gurion's network behind his back, while Ben-Gurion supposedly is in the Negev off on a spiritual retreat or something like that. And, that it was Perez who was said in Sharet's diaries to say that that Perez's circle, their intent was to frighten the West, terrorize the West. So you have everyone from Ben-Gurion and Perez, these so-called liberal left, kind of leaders of Israel, in bed with the Moshe Dayans, in bed with the Yitzhak Shamirs and the Menachem Begins. And this is then crystallized the actual, I would say, the logical result, the very destructive, violent result of that first generation of that difficult political alliance then devolves, I would say, into then the rise of the Likud party when you have the Menachem Begins, the Yitzhak Shamirs, and a little Perez sort of in between, and then Netanyahu for a quarter century. And so Netanyahu is not just some kind of token figure. No, he represents the dark heart of the Israeli so-called security state, the deep politics of Israel. And then I'll just finish by pointing out once again the nuclear question. The nuclear question is at the epicenter of all of this. Perez was the godfather of the. He was basically if Yitzhak Shamir was Ben Gurion's global assassination czar, then Shimon Peres was Ben Gurion's Israeli nuclear weapons czar, and it was Perez who helped found the nuclear program in relationship to the French. Remember, there's this whole French connection to the Kennedy assassination that seems to run directly through the sort of deep political black operations forces inside of the French security state that helped originally set up the Israeli nuclear program in Dimona. And then it's passed on then really to Netanyahu in many ways. And remember, Netanyahu is working for Arnon Milchan's front company when Milchan is smuggling nuclear triggers, Krytrons, from the United States into Israel. So you could really say that Netanyahu is the godfather of the Oliver Stone JFK film in certain ways. That he's sort of behind the scenes. He's the guy. And Perez has sort of passed on this nuclear espionage leadership from himself to then Netanyahu and Arnon Milchan.
Wow. Indeed. And I would, to look at it, I guess, from a more American perspective in terms of our moment with the confrontation of Netanyahu, at least as publicly as we've ever seen it. I would, looking at it from that perspective, I would say that the rise of Netanyahu and the rise of Likud is very key to and coincides with a number of developments in our own society. And I don't know enough about the economic and political history of the state of Israel as far as historical economic policies and all of this. That would be for other people to cover and to fill in the dots much more effectively. But you can see, whereas in recent decades, over the last number of decades, you have this combination of I don't think this is insignificant, the Likud party being established I believe by Begin and Shamir in the same year as in the United States, the Heritage Foundation is set up. And the Heritage Foundation becomes this key think tank organization for what is called the New Right, and has been shaping policy of quote unquote conservative governments, conservative administrations for a number of decades, but now is now spearheading this Project 2025 of the agenda for when Trump. Now it would have to be Trump because all the other Republicans have basically been defeated candidates, but for a blueprint for Trump to take back the presidency and the agenda and the administrative or lack thereof administrative state, when you think about that, and the legislative agenda and all of this. And this is set up right as the Likud party set up. And then in addition to that, you have the Likud forming an alliance with the Christian Zionists, as you might call them. You might put air quotes around that, of the original group of the moral majority of Jerry Falwell, and supporting the original, maybe you'd call it original spiritual compromise of American Christianity, in terms of conservative Christianity, of the supporting of Ronald Reagan over Jimmy Carter, who was seen as obviously as hostile to the sitting Likud government, I think, at the time in 1980, and then the much more, I think, the spiritual compromise that followed many years later with Donald Trump. But you have that, and then you have this, and I go back to the economic aspect of it. There is this, certainly once Netanyahu comes to prominence, you have the merging, it seems like, of the Israeli economy and a push to mold it more in the direction of what had taken influence with the Chicago School, Milton Friedman type of economics, with some inroads into the more libertarian elements of the quote unquote free market and the unleashing the power of business. And there was an interview Netanyahu did with I believe the head of the Hoover Institute, which talked about Israel's quote unquote free market revolution and all of this, and Netanyahu helping to spearhead that. He comes in 1996, the same year as the Fox News channel was established, obviously with Rupert Murdoch and Roger Ailes, and all the damage I would say that Fox has done to our domestic. So obviously, it's in many, many different ways, I think. So Netanyahu, really, the rise of Netanyahu and the rise of Likud is directly coinciding with the rise of some of our with a lot of the major power play shifts in our own society over the past number of decades. And I'll throw one more in there. When you think of the Netanyahu and you think of Russia and you think of this relationship that obviously the Netanyahu has with the Russian wing, and then the combination of the terror wars and the culture wars, which comes along with this new right, and obviously Heritage Foundation and many, many other interconnected groups, and now that is seen through, I think, through an organization like CPAC that we talked about before, of the hybrid of the terror war and the culture war, and we're seeing that now. So Netanyahu, in terms of a strictly American context, I'm looking at this as a Western context, as Americans here, directly coincides with the rise of Netanyahu, directly coincides a lot of ways with the changes fundamentally that have led us, and I think where the 11/9 moment and where we stand right now on the continued precipice of uncharted waters as far as our society goes politically, et cetera.
This is a very good point, and I think this is a very important, deep and long-term analysis, is what you're talking about, the intersection of political and cultural warfare over decades and the arc of that, and especially the role of the Heritage Foundation networks, and then from there into these Fox News networks. And I would say, before filling in a little bit more of the maybe potentially the deep espionage economic background of what you're beginning to point to, Greg, too, in terms of the actual history here, I would just say in the current moment, in the last week or two, basically a good example of what is actually going down right now in terms of those networks and those kinds of political warfare strategies is exemplified by the Trump Mar-a-Lago meetings. One with key installed, basically Netanyahu to Putin intermediary access, CPAC, aggrandized, strong nationalist, Hungarian Prime Minister Orban meeting with Trump at Mar-a-Lago, but also the meeting of Elon Musk at Mar-a-Lago. And I think there is no better example of Orban is really like the global archetype of the culture war in many ways, for that aspect of the especially of current MAGA CPAC type politics. And then Musk is the key, money man. And then also, and many, you could say now with his purchase of Twitter, he's the key media figure. And you'll see that I think since Musk met with Trump, you'll see a very overt and intense push by Musk to basically start amplifying and directly repeating the kind of narrative warfare lines that you're going to see a lot from this entire Trump network, which is like, if the Democrats win again, it's the end of America. Basically, the implication of the bloodbath of America on all fronts, economic and political. The immigration issue, and Musk is now sort of taking the gloves off in terms of basically fully attacking the Biden administration, and very obviously showing that he is pushing everybody on X to get behind the MAGA operation. So I think this is a good example of what's going on. And by the way, like it looks like everyone from Elon Musk to Marjorie Taylor Greene is now directly attacking someone like Seth Abramson and his work. The Musk attack looked like it was initiated by Ben Horowitz's partner at their investment firm, Mark Andreessen. And they seem to be calling Abramson a combination of a nutty conspiracy theorist while also representing everything that's wrong with the woke left in terms of his being a professor of media and cultural, talking about meta-modernism. So they try to associate him with postmodernism, malarkey of some sort. And so there's something growing very specifically out of these meetings at Mar-a-Lago with Trump. And then one more thing in terms of this very specific Trump moment is before I forgot, I wanted to bring up the deeper background of what it all means in terms of the Greenberg connection to Trump's current financial situation and the potential promises that might be guaranteed in relationship to that Greenberg backing, and that it was under a Shaul Eisenberg actually front company, Atwell Security, that in the late 80s, I think 1987-ish is when the thing fell apart, but there was an attempt to take over the World Trade Center Port Authority security in a previous incident from when it was actually then solidified under Kroll in the run-up to September 11th by a very Yitzhak Shamir-esque Israeli deep state operation, including two key people, Peter Zvi Malkin and then Avraham, a.k.a. Shalom Ben-Dor, who they actually got caught and sort of taken out of the situation after the New York Port Authority, quote unquote, found out that Ben-Dor had actually been found guilty or had been found to have assassinated Palestinians while I believe having them assassinated while he was maybe the head of Shin Bet under Shamir. And they attempted to take over World Trade Center security in the late 80s. And this was very much some kind of Shamir, Eisenberg, very likely Greenberg, lubricated kind of attempted operation that fell apart. And I would say then you see Plan B is the first World Trade Center attack, 1993, a very strong Israeli intelligence safe house connection to that operation. And then eventually the big wedding of September 11th. So this is more, I would say, more indicators that this kind of history is immediately relevant in terms of who Trump is taking on as his political backers. And that's putting aside the entire question of the TikTok question, the TikTok scandal, the Steve Mnuchin having been reported as trying to put together an American group of buyers for TikTok, and then also Jeff Yaz, a key TikTok player. By the way, people should go look at Seb Solomon's article once again, many dozens of pages about the technocratic approach to Gaza and Palestine that she published in December of 2023 that deals with a lot of these networks, including Jeff Yaz. But Greg, if it's okay, I just wanted to just read a little bit from the beginning of a chapter from a book that you, I believe, originally became aware of, and that we have not yet fully digested in terms of its political and economic implications, but titled The Armageddon Network by Michael Saba. that will then hone in on the importance of this year, these 1970s, and both from 1973 in the Likud and Heritage and all of that, but also into the 1979 in terms of the Talpiot program and some of the Jerusalem conference and Netanyahu beginning to really push the modern concept of the war on terror, and then the launching of, by very shady people, both some with an Israeli background, some with an American background, of things like the technology transfer office. And a lot of this does surround things like JINSA, the Heritage Foundation, and the intersection of all that. Is that cool, Greg, if I
Yeah,
read
go
just the
for it.
beginning of this?
Yeah,
All right.
yeah, go for it.
Okay, this is chapter 11 from the Armageddon Network by Michael Saba, titled Exports from Behind the Zion Curtain, page 175. Quote, Stephen Bryant's preaching on the need to protect advanced U.S. technology created the impression that the Soviets were working around the clock in the United States and abroad to get a hold of the latest breakthroughs, and that money-hungry Europeans were not the least bit concerned about stopping them. However, as his own report suggested, this was only the tip of the iceberg. U.S. technology was crucial to the Israelis as well. As the General Accounting Office pointed out, quote, Israel's technological exports are heavily dependent on foreign components. In Israel's fastest growing industry, the electronics field, about 35% of the knowledge is acquired from the United States in licenses, production, or technology transfer. Almost every Israeli arms production effort includes a U.S. input, unquote. Apparently, however, the Israelis had not always been able to get the U.S. technology they wanted through official channels. According to a top-secret Central Intelligence Agency report made public in 1979, the Israelis had also developed an elaborate network for collecting U.S. technology. Quote, the Israeli intelligence service depends heavily on the various Jewish communities and organizations abroad for recruiting agents and eliciting general information. Israeli agents usually operate discreetly within Jewish communities and are under instructions to handle their missions with utmost tact to avoid embarrassment to Israel. Israel's program for accelerating its technological, scientific, and military development as rapidly as possible has been enhanced by exploiting scientific exchange programs. Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service, plays a key role in this endeavor. In addition to large-scale acquisition of published scientific papers and technical journals from all over the world through overt channels, the Israelis devote a considerable portion of their covert operations to obtaining scientific and technical intelligence. This has included attempts to penetrate certain classified defense projects in the United States and other Western nations, unquote of that quote. And before I just finish on another page or so, just a reminder that this is, as we pointed out, this is a key piece of the Epstein-Maxwell network. When you go back to Robert Maxwell as an Israeli agent, he was not just a Mossad agent per se, although obviously Mossad, being the epicenter of human intelligence in Israel, is a major coordinator of these wider and larger Israeli technological espionage activities. But Maxwell was not only a British politician, a British media magnate in competition with Rupert Murdoch and all of that, but he was also a global owner and purchaser of manuals, of scientific manuals, of handbooks, educational handbooks. And remember, that's some of the background of the Promise software scandal in terms of Maxwell apparently using it and its installed Israeli intelligence backdoor to basically distribute it around the world to exfiltrate and then infiltrate into Israel a lot of serious intelligence data, technological data from around the world, but so intensely focused on questions of the U.S. nuclear apparatus and the New Mexico nuclear laboratories, which, of course, Epstein had his Zorro Ranch right in the epicenter there in terms of the combination of Los Alamos and Sandia. And we've talked about before the allegations by Maxwell, one of Maxwell's biographers, Gordon Thomas, in his book Seeds of Fire, about this infamous Cerro Gordo fire operation, it looks like, in the spring of 2000, that looked like it was the cover for what Thomas says is a joint Israeli-Chinese intelligence operation to directly infiltrate into, I think it's Los Alamos specifically, and then it looks like they were able to exfiltrate the key nuclear terrorism, the Department of Energy's secret nuclear bomb squad, the NEST that was out of the country for the first time in 3 years for the September 11th, especially Ground Zero operation in the European theater under the codename Jackal Cave, of a drill in a NATO context of undoing a terrorist nuclear weapon. And this looks to have been, if these allegations by Thomas and Seeds of Fire are true, the specific target of Chinese and Israeli cooperation in an intelligence operation to target the Department of Energy's nuclear bomb squad's secret drives and exfiltrate all of that information. So there's a very deep and long intergenerational history here in terms of the focus on technological intelligence in the figure of someone like Robert Maxwell specifically, that is right behind the scenes in terms of what is being talked about by Michael Saba in this quote. All right, I'm going to continue on a little bit more here of the Armageddon Network by Michael Saba, page 176. This is back to Saba's text. Quote, "There was thus great irony in statements made by Pearl," that's Richard Pearl, the Prince of Darkness, "and Bryan about the need for better controls over technology transfers. While Pearl claimed the 1970s had been a, quote, decade in which there were tremendously damaging leakages of technology from the West to the East, unquote, he failed to point out that the Israelis, like the Soviets, were conducting covert operations as well as overt operations to gain access to U.S. technological secrets. In their incessant railings against the Soviets' covert efforts to acquire technology, Pearl and Bryan clearly had the effect of diverting attention away from any operations the Israelis might have been carrying out. They also painted the technology transfer issue as one primarily concerned with the United States national security. The reality of the situation was quite different. Entire national economies were at stake. Both the European and American business communities stepped up their protests over the economic consequences implicit in the controls that Pearl and Bryan were advocating. Even before Congress sat down to complete work on the Export Administration Act, the United States stiffened its enforcement of existing controls. One British firm was unable to get a license to re-import even British-made spare parts from America. Another company, Marconi Avionics, found that equipment it had sent to the United States for repair had been impounded. The material was seized in the U.S. under a Customs Department program called Operation Exodus. The program, which was funded in part by Bryan's office, resulted in the detainment of 7,500 shipments and the seizure of nearly 3,000 more, worth over $175 million between 1981 and 1983. Paddy Ashdown, a member of the British Parliament, responded to the thrust of the program by stating, quote, "The Americans are in a position to do more damage to establishments than the unions could have ever done," unquote. The United States was also seeking tighter controls over the export of personal computers. British officials scoffed at this, noting that such computers could be bought at nearly any store and were often used by children. Richard Pearl countered these objections by stating, quote, "We're using them now for things like missile guidance. They're going to transform the battlefield in the immediate future. It's easy to say it's silly to ban the export of children's toy computers, but it isn't children who are using them in the Soviet Union. It's the military," unquote. While admitting that it would be impossible to stop a diplomat from carrying any product out of a country, Pearl indicated he was worried about bulk deliveries that could turn them into standard issue items for Russian tank commanders. Patty Ashdown also objected to the large number of new items which Pearl and Bryan were trying to get COCOM to approve for strategic controls. Quote, "The list the Americans are trying to get through COCOM isn't based on national security. It amounts to a complete inventory of their businessmen." According to the Spotlight, which continued to investigate the Bryan case after other media had dropped it, Israeli trade representatives were telling West European customers, quote, "If the Americans cut you off from their high technology market, come to us. We can get it for you," unquote. All right, I'm going to stop there. There's a lot more there. Now, obviously, the sort of the background of the Spotlight and all that, there's a lot of things that we still have to deal with in terms of, aspects of where a lot of the facts that we have in terms of the Israeli part of the Kennedy assassination come from, in terms of Michael Collins Piper and that whole background, and how it looks to be tied in directly with what eventually evolves into like something like the New Horizons network in many ways, and the axis of resistance and the multipolarist Dugin types that we see being very much highlighted recently in terms of the Russophile conference. It seems like a sort of a New Horizons for Russia kind of conference in many ways. But the factual aspect of this that really points to that these people who appear to be Cold War hawks, who are also intensely not only like Israeli partisans, but really like Zionist assets, like they're being in many ways handled, it looks like, by people coming directly out of the Israeli Talpiot program. In terms of setting up these office of, technology transfers and all of that, that there is this entire political economic piece of this that appears to really not only help destroy the potential American-European business relationship, but it also seems to create a vacuum, an American vacuum, where the Israelis are ready to totally enter into becoming the middleman in many ways in terms of this period of the Cold War. And that's why I think there are these really big geopolitical, economic kind of implications here that you were referencing in terms of what's going on in terms of the political cultural warfare operations that we see happening over the same period of time.
Yeah, this sounds like something that was going on in the Reagan administration that probably would have been a source of conflict between these types of people and then the more the more American the more U.S. national security set for sure. And following up, these names that you're mentioning from this book here, Stephen Bryan, his wife Shoshana Bryan is connected to this day to the Center for Security Policy, the Frank Gaffney group, and these are the Pearl nests. These are the people who came out of Henry Scoop Jackson's office. These are the Richard Pearls, and you could also throw in obviously a Douglas Feith or a David Worms, or the people that came up with the clean break. And these are the neocons, like the real hardcore hawks that are still, to a large extent, still behind the shadows, while the PNAC gang and the what we call the paleo neocons and the Bill Kristols and the Robert Kagans and their ilk ultimately took the blame for the terror wars, and then ultimately were then scapegoated as the only neocon hawks who had any influence when it came to all of the never Trumpers who wanted to stop Trump from ending the wars and all of this. So I mean, it's this is a very crucial a nest of people here that we've talked a lot about over the years. But there's a lot of intrigue, obviously, as it relates to both the Israeli component and then the bigger dynamics of like the Cold War and even of the tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and now the U.S. and Russia there. But yeah, these are at the heart of this is at the heart of. I go back to the boys from GINSA and CSP article from The Nation in 2002. Remember, it was a Center for Security Policy made Frank Gaffney, who is obviously directly tied in with all these people, makes Paul Wolfowitz look dovish on settlements. I mean, that was basically, I'm paraphrasing, but like this is the heart of like the nest of like the really I would say the hawks of the uber hawks of the hawks, and then they become obviously, and then the big tie-in with the terror war and then the culture war through things like the global clash of civilizations. But even here, you're seeing early attempts to like really break off the U.S. and Europe, which was obviously something that we've seen happen again in recent years here. But this would have been one of the earlier attempts to do that. And it'd be interesting to get more information on that as far as this. What I would think was probably a pretty, I would say, probably a pretty divisive battle in the early days of the Reagan administration. It sounds like.
Definitely, and and maybe we'll finish up here for now for this episode. But this is a major component to understand in terms of how we got here, and also what to be aware of, concerned about in terms of this current moment, which is really, in many ways, I think, the apex of this much longer term operation. And so it really is important to understand how these people who present themselves as these kind of uber hawks in terms of a Cold War dynamic in direct service of their Zionist allegiances and really Israeli partisan assethood ultimately serve two functions. One is to set up a void, to manufacture an American void where the Israelis can step in as the brokers or the middle managers more globally in terms of technology, and in place of the United States. And at the same time, and this can be said to be an unintended consequence, but I'm suspicious in terms of the larger strategy of all of this, in terms of understanding some potential long-term Soviet-Israeli play. And now there's a lot of history to go through in order to get there, to understand the Soviet approach to Israel, and also the Israel-Palestine quote-unquote conflict, and the management of it in many ways, in more intensely over time from both sides in certain ways, and also this sort of Operation SIG type thing of hanging that whole thing in a political culture war kind of way as an albatross, in many cases a very justified way, around the neck of the United States. Okay. But at the same time, these uber Soviet hawks end up, creating the kind of exact divides geopolitically that are right on the surface right now in terms of the United States and Europe, the United States and England, those alliances in a very direct political economic fashion. And, who benefits from all of that is an important question to ask. And so although there is this, espionage history, the deep political history where the facts are difficult to sometimes ascertain and to analyze, the surface of this is very clear, and it's coming to increasingly to a head in terms of this very year's election processes and the ongoing war on the American body politic, I would say.
Indeed, and I guess with that we will wrap up here until we get back into this again next time. But yeah, a lot of as we're talking here, just more things open up in my mind as far as things to think about and take into consideration. So this has been fun. Thank you, Jeremy.
All right, thank you, Greg, too. All right, and end the war on the Palestinians in Gaza, and thank you, everybody out there. Until next time, AnteDote, we are out.